November 2, 1942. El Alamein, Western Egypt. The desert did not care who was winning. That was what a man learned after 18 months of pushing armies back and forth across the same stretch of bleached earth. The sand did not shift for Rommel. It did not part for Montgomery. It buried the dead without distinction and swallowed the footprints of the living within hours. And on the morning of the 2nd of November, 1942, as the sun climbed above the thin coastal haze and the temperature began its slow, relentless climb toward 50 degrees Celsius, the western desert stretched out beneath Field Marshal Erwin Rommel in every direction, indifferent, ancient, and utterly unconcerned with the fact that the army he had spent 2 years building was being destroyed. He had not slept. He could not remember the last time he had slept properly. His body, which had betrayed him months earlier with jaundice and stomach ailments severe enough to send him back to Austria for treatment, had not fully recovered. He was thinner than he had been at Gazala. Thinner than he had been at Tobruk. The dust had settled into the lines of his face and the creases of his uniform in a way that could not be brushed away. His eyes, always sharp, carried a dullness that his staff had noticed but none dared mention. He stood outside his forward command post, a collection of armored vehicles and radio trucks dug into a shallow depression near the Ramon track, and he watched the smoke rising from the battlefield to the east. Not the clean, theatrical smoke of propaganda films. This was the gray-black choke of burning vehicles, burning fuel, burning men, a smear across the morning sky that stretched from the coast in the north to the edge of the Katara Depression in the south. The sound reached him in waves. Artillery. The sharp crack of tank guns engaging at close range. The deeper, rolling thunder of RAF bombers making another pass. The sounds of an army being taken apart. Rommel turned from the smoke and walked back inside. The command post was cramped, functional, and humming with the low static of a dozen radio sets. Maps covered every available surface, tables, the hoods of vehicles, even the ground where officers crouched with pencils and compasses. The air tasted of diesel and sweat. Flies moved in lazy circles near the ceiling of the main staff tent, unbothered by the war. General-Lieutenant Siegfried Westphal, Rommel's chief of staff, was on the radio when Rommel entered. Westphal was a lean, careful man, the kind of officer who kept meticulous records and trusted numbers over instinct. He had been with Rommel since before Tobruk. He had watched the Desert Fox at his best. The blitzkrieg brilliance of Gazala, the stunning fall of the fortress in a single day, the promotion to General Feldmarschall that had come by radio while the dust of victory was still in the air. And he had watched him at his worst. The retreat after Alam Halfa. The weeks of waiting with dwindling supplies. The slow, grinding knowledge that the man who had once moved like lightning across Libya was now trapped behind 500,000 mines he had laid himself, waiting for an enemy who outnumbered him in every category that mattered. Westphal looked up as Rommel entered and said nothing. He did not need to. The expression on his face was one Rommel had seen increasingly in the past 10 days, a careful, controlled blankness that was the German officer's version of dread. Rommel sat down at the map table and pulled the latest reconnaissance reports toward him. He had been reading them since before dawn, cross-referencing them with Vaughan Thomas' radio transmissions from the Afrika Korps positions to the east. The numbers were not difficult to understand. They were simply impossible to accept. On the morning of October 23, when Montgomery had opened his offensive with over 800 guns firing simultaneously, Rommel had commanded roughly 540 tanks across his entire front, German and Italian combined. By October 25, when he had rushed back from Austria to take command after General Stumm's sudden death from a heart attack at the front, half of the German armor was already gone. The British had broken into his minefields faster than he had believed possible, and the Desert Air Force had begun systematically destroying whatever moved on the surface during daylight hours. The numbers had continued to fall. Each day brought a new report, each report worse than the last. By October 30, the two German panzer divisions, the 15th and the 21st, the fighting core of everything Rommel had built in Africa, had been reduced to 148 tanks between them. The Italian armored divisions fared no better. And fuel. The fuel situation had become something beyond critical, beyond desperate. It had become, in the language of logistics, terminal. On November 1, the tankers Tripolino and Ostia had been torpedoed and sunk by RAF aircraft northwest of Tobruk. They had been carrying the last significant fuel delivery that might have reached the front in time to matter. Without them, Rommel's tanks could not move. Not in the way tanks were meant to move, fast, decisive, exploiting gaps and flanking enemy positions. They could barely crawl. Some could not move at all. Rommel had told his commanders on October 30, in words that his staff recorded and that history would remember, it would be quite impossible to disengage from the enemy. There was no gasoline for such a maneuver. They had only one choice, and that was to fight to the end at Alamein. He had meant it when he said it. He had believed, or forced himself to believe, that the position could be held. That something, a British mistake, a gap in the aerial bombardment, a miraculous delivery of supplies, might change the equation. Rommel had built his entire career on the belief that boldness could overcome material inferiority. He had proved it at Tobruk. He had proved it at Gazala. He had staked his reputation, his career, and the lives of every man under his command on that belief. But on the morning of November 2, as Operation Supercharge tore through the Ramon track and British armor began pouring through gaps in the Axis line, the belief was gone. The attack had begun at 0100 hours. Montgomery, methodical as always, had launched it after a 7-hour aerial bombardment and a 4.5-hour artillery barrage, the kind of preparation that Rommel, in his offensive days, would have considered almost obscenely cautious. The 2nd New Zealand Division had spearheaded the assault, supported by the 9th Armoured Brigade, which had started with roughly 130 tanks and arrived at its start line with only 94 due to minefields. They attacked toward Tel El Akakar, the fortified position that sat at the base of the Axis defense along the Ramon lateral track. The fighting was savage. The 9th Armored Brigade ran into the concentrated anti-tank guns of the Axis line and was mauled badly enough that its commander, Brigadier Curry, reported at one point that his brigade was almost destroyed. But the New Zealand infantry had already broken through on either side, and by the time the sun was fully up, the Ramon track, the main supply artery running north to south behind the Axis front, was under threat. By mid-morning, Rommel understood what was happening. He had ordered 21st Panzer Division from the front line on October 31 to form a mobile counterattacking force, and the division had been thrown into the fighting around Tel El Akakar. The 15th Panzer Division was already engaged along the northern sector. Both divisions were fighting desperately, but they were fighting with what amounted to the last reserves of fuel and ammunition on the battlefield. Each tank that engaged a British Sherman burned fuel that could not be replaced. Each shell that was fired from an 88mm gun was one fewer shell in a stockpile that was measured in days, not weeks. The counterattacks, when they came, were fierce but brief. The Afrika Korps fought the way it had always fought, with ferocity, with tactical brilliance, with a courage that earned the grudging respect of every British commander who faced them. But courage could not change arithmetic. For every British tank that burned, there were 3 more waiting behind it. For every Axis tank that fought, there was barely enough fuel to get it back to its laager at nightfall. By the afternoon of November 2nd, the battle around Tel El Akakar had settled into a grinding attritional exchange that Rommel knew he could not win. The 9th Armored Brigade, despite its heavy losses, had punched through the Axis line in several places. British infantry was consolidating positions along the Ramon track. And to the north, the Australians. Fierce, stubborn men who had been fighting along the coastal road for days, continued to press southward, threatening to cut off the 164th Infantry Division entirely. Rommel spent the afternoon moving between his command post and the forward positions, as he always did. It was his nature, his compulsion, the quality that had made him both great and dangerous. He could not command from a desk. He had to see. He had to touch the battlefield with his own hands, read it with his own eyes, feel the rhythm of the fighting the way a musician feels the beat. His staff hated it. Kesselring had complained that Rommel cruised about the battlefield like a divisional commander rather than an army leader. Westphal and Gauze, his other chief of staff, had argued that in the African desert this was often the only way to command effectively. They were right. But on November 2nd, what Rommel saw when he touched the battlefield was not something that could be fixed by a bold decision or a sudden flanking maneuver. What he saw was the end. Night fell slowly, the way it always did in November, the sun dropping toward the Mediterranean in the west, the sky turning from white to gold to a deep, burning copper before the darkness came in from the east. The temperature began to fall. The fighting did not stop. Artillery continued to exchange fire along the Ramon track. RAF bombers made their last passes of the day, dropping incendiaries and fragmentation bombs on the congested Axis positions. Tracer rounds streaked across the darkening sky like stitches in black cloth. Rommel was back at the command post by last light. He sat at the map table and studied the positions one more time, though the positions had already changed since the last report came in. Everything was fluid. Everything was deteriorating. He picked up a pencil and began to sketch on the map, not an attack plan, but a withdrawal route. The road to Fuka, 50 miles to the west, where a previously prepared defensive position waited. It was not a good position. It was not the kind of position that could be held for long against an enemy with Montgomery's resources. But it was 50 miles of distance, 50 miles of time, and time was the only thing that might still save what remained of his army. Vaughan Thomas' report arrived by radio shortly after dark. The Afrika Korps commander had been around the battlefield himself, checking the positions of his 2 panzer divisions. His assessment was stark and clinical. He would have at most 35 tanks available to fight the next day. His artillery and anti-tank weapons had been reduced to 1/3 of their strength at the start of the battle. The fuel situation made any significant movement impossible without a resupply that was not coming. Rommel read the report twice. Then he looked up at Westphal. There was no discussion. There was no argument. There was no moment of dramatic hesitation or anguished moral struggle. Rommel was a soldier. He understood numbers. He understood the difference between courage and stupidity. And the numbers told him, with a clarity that admitted no other interpretation, that if he remained at Alamein for another full day of fighting, his army would be destroyed. Not broken, not mauled, not forced to retreat. Destroyed. The mobile core of his force, the panzer divisions, the motorized infantry, the units that could still move and fight, would be annihilated. What would remain would be tens of thousands of men on foot, without transport, without fuel, without ammunition, and without any possibility of reaching the west before Montgomery's armor caught them in the open. He gave the order. The mobile forces. The Afrika Korps, the 90th Light Division, the Italian XX Corps, and the 19th Flak Division, were to begin a fighting withdrawal during the night, moving west toward Fuca. The immobile infantry, the Italian divisions that lacked motorized transport, the German infantry units that had been dug into fixed positions for weeks, was to hold as long as possible, then follow on foot when the way was clear. It was the only decision available to him. He knew it. Westphal knew it. Every officer in the command post knew it. And Rommel knew something else, too, something that sat in his stomach like a stone as he gave the order. He knew that Berlin would not approve. He knew that Hitler, 1,000 miles away in his headquarters at Rassenburg, had not seen the smoke or heard the guns or watched the tanks burn. He knew that the Führer, who had once promoted him to field marshal with a radio message delivered while the dust of Tobruk was still settling, would see this withdrawal as surrender. As failure. As cowardice. Rommel did not care. Not in that moment. In that moment, he was looking at the faces of the men around him, Westphal, the radio operators, the junior officers who had followed him across 2,000 miles of desert. And he was calculating how many of them would still be alive in 48 hours if he stayed. He chose them. He chose the men on the ground over the man in Berlin. And he knew, with a certainty that went beyond military judgment into something deeper and colder, that this choice would follow him for the rest of his life. The withdrawal began at 1330 hours on November 3rd. It did not begin cleanly. It began the way all withdrawals begin in war, with confusion, with delay, with units that had not received the order and units that had received it but could not move because their fuel tanks were dry. The Afrika Korps attempted to disengage from the Ramon track and pull back westward, but the British anti-tank guns along the track kept firing, and the RAF kept bombing, and the Italian infantry divisions, the ones without transport, could not move at all. They sat in their positions, exhausted and bewildered, watching the German motorized units pull away from them. Then, at 1330 hours, the message from Hitler arrived. It came through the radio, decoded by the signals section and handed to Rommel by a junior officer whose hand was steady but whose face was not. The message was long. Longer than it needed to be, padded with the kind of rhetoric that Hitler favored, the language of absolute commitment and absolute sacrifice. But the substance of it was simple. Rommel was to hold. He was not to yield a single yard of ground. He was to throw every gun and every man into the battle. As to his troops, the Führer wrote, he could show them no other road than that to victory or death. Victory or death. Rommel read the message standing up. He did not move for several seconds. The command post was very quiet. The radio operators had stopped transmitting. Westphal stood nearby, watching him, waiting. Then Rommel folded the message and put it in his pocket. He turned to the officers around him and gave the order to halt the withdrawal. He obeyed Hitler. Or he appeared to. He ordered the Afrika Korps to stop its retreat and return to a position roughly 10 miles east of El Daba, on the coast. He ordered the Italian infantry to hold their positions. He radioed Berlin confirming his determination to hold the battlefield, as the Führer had commanded. But as he gave these orders, he was already calculating. He was looking at the map, at the positions of his forces, at the positions of Montgomery's forces, and he was doing the mathematics that every commander does when he receives an order he believes will destroy his army. He was measuring the time between the order to hold and the moment when holding became physically impossible. The moment when the British broke through in force, when the last tanks ran dry, when there was nothing left to hold with. And he was measuring the time it would take to resume the withdrawal when that moment came. Measuring the distance to Fuka. Measuring the fuel his mobile units had already burned during the hours they had spent stopping and starting. Every hour spent obeying Hitler's order was an hour lost. Every mile of distance his forces failed to cover was a mile that Montgomery's armor would gain on them. Von Thoma came to see him that evening. The Afrika Korps commander had been around the battlefield again, checking on his battered divisions. He told Rommel what he had seen. The 15th Panzer Division had 10 tanks left. The 21st Panzer had 14. The Italian Littorio Division had 17. He told Rommel that he had read the Führer order. Rommel had shown it to him. And he understood what it meant. He left to assume command of the remaining panzers, to fight the rearguard action that would buy the withdrawal the time it needed. Rommel watched him go. Von Thoma was a brave man, a proud man, a man who believed in duty the way Rommel himself had once believed in it without reservation. He would fight. He would hold his position until there was nothing left to hold it with. And then, if he was still alive, he would be captured. He was captured the next morning. The British tanks found him standing in the open, unarmed, watching his last tanks burn. They took him prisoner with the quiet efficiency of men who had seen enough of war to know that even the enemy deserved a moment of dignity. The night of November 3rd passed in a strange, suspended tension. Rommel did not sleep. He sat at the map table and watched the clock and waited. The radio traffic was constant. Reports from the front, reports from the Italian commanders, reports from Kesselring in Rome trying to push more fuel forward from Benghazi, fuel that would never arrive in time. The Desert Air Force flew through the night, bombing the congested positions around the Ramon track, dropping incendiaries on the vehicle loggers where thousands of men and machines were packed together in the darkness. At 1745 hours, Rommel made his decision again. He had not yet received permission from Berlin to resume the withdrawal. The response to his initial signal, the one he had sent on November 2nd, explaining his untenable position and requesting permission to fall back to Fuka, had been Hitler's victory or death order. Nothing else had come. Nothing else was coming. Berlin did not understand. Berlin was 1,000 miles away, insulated from the smell of burning diesel and the sound of dying men, and Berlin had decided that Rommel's army would hold or be annihilated. Rommel gave the order for a general retreat. He did not wait for permission. He did not radio Berlin to announce his intentions. He simply picked up the telephone to his corps commanders and told them to move west. Now. Everything that could still move was to move. The mobile forces were to pull back along the coast road toward Fuca and beyond. The rear guard, whatever was left of von Thomà's panzers and the Italian armored divisions, was to fight a delaying action, buying time for the withdrawal to gain distance. It was, by any military standard, the correct decision. It was the decision that saved the mobile core of his army, the units that would fight again at Mareth, at Kasserine Pass, in Tunisia. It was the decision that preserved thousands of lives that would otherwise have been spent in a futile stand at Alamein. It was the decision that historians would later point to as evidence of Rommel's independence, his courage, his willingness to put the welfare of his men above the commands of a distant political leader who had no understanding of what was happening on the ground. But in the moment, in that specific, unrepeatable moment of November 3, 1942, at 1745 hours, when Rommel picked up the telephone and gave the order, none of that mattered. What mattered was simpler, and darker, and more human than any historical judgment could capture. What mattered was that he had looked at the numbers. He had looked at the map. He had looked at the faces of his men. And he had chosen to disobey. The retreat became a rout within hours. The withdrawal that had begun with some semblance of order on the night of November 2, been halted by Hitler's order on November 3, and resumed again that evening, quickly dissolved into chaos. Units that had stopped to obey the hold order now had to restart, burning fuel they could not spare. Communications broke down. The Italian infantry divisions, without transport, could not move fast enough to stay ahead of the British armor. Thousands of men were left behind. Not abandoned deliberately, but simply overtaken by the speed of the collapse. The coast road became a nightmare. Vehicles of every type, tanks, trucks, half-tracks, staff cars, jammed the narrow strip of tarmac between the sea and the desert, moving west in a crawling, choking column that stretched for miles. The RAF found them at dawn on November 4 and began bombing in earnest. Stuka dive bombers screamed down on the column, dropping explosives into the packed mass of vehicles and men. Hurricanes strafed at treetop level, their machine guns tearing through the convoy like needles through cloth. Vehicles burned. Men scattered into the desert, running, crawling, trying to find cover that did not exist on the flat, featureless plain. Rommel was in the column. He had moved his headquarters into a Kübelwagen and joined the retreat along the coast road, the same road he had driven east in triumph just months before. He watched the bombing. He watched the burning. He watched men he had led across 2,000 miles of desert die in the sand because there was not enough fuel to move them fast enough to escape. At one point, his Kübelwagen was strafed by a British hurricane. The bullet struck the ground around the vehicle, kicking up sprays of sand and gravel. Rommel did not flinch. He had been under fire more times than he could count. The bullets missed. The car kept moving west. The pursuit continued for days. Montgomery, characteristically cautious, did not send his armor racing after the retreating Axis forces with the speed that might have destroyed them entirely. The British were cautious, methodical, careful to secure their rear before advancing. It was the right approach for a commander who had just won a decisive victory and did not want to risk squandering it. But it gave Rommel's mobile forces time to put distance between themselves and the battlefield. By November 5, the motorized elements of the Axis were already 50 miles west of Alamein, moving toward Mersa Matruh. Behind them, on the beaches and in the sand near the Ramon track, lay the wreckage of an army. Thousands of Italian and German soldiers, many of them wounded, many of them on foot, waited for the British to come and take them prisoner. Montgomery's forces swept them up over the following days. Tens of thousands of men, surrendering without resistance, because there was nothing left to fight with. The battle was over. Hitler rescinded the stand-fast order on November 5. By then, Rommel's forces were already retreating. The order arrived too late to matter, which was precisely the point. Rommel had gambled, not on boldness, as he had so many times before, but on the simple, brutal calculation that a living army in retreat was worth more than a dead army holding a position. He was right. The mobile corps of the Panzerarmee Afrika, the units that had survived the withdrawal, that had burned their last fuel getting away from Alamein, would fight again. They would fight at Mersa Matruh. They would fight at El Agheila, where Rommel had launched so many of his offensives. They would fight in Tunisia, in January and February and March of 1943, when the Americans came from the west and Montgomery pressed from the east, and the final, bloody end of the North African campaign played itself out in the highlands above the Mediterranean. But Alamein was the turning point. Not just militarily, though it was that, undeniably, the first clear and irreversible defeat inflicted on a German army in the war. It was the turning point for Rommel himself. The man who had once charged across Libya with nothing but audacity and a handful of tanks, who had taken Tobruk in a single day, who had been promoted to field marshal on the strength of a victory so stunning that even his enemies praised him, that man had looked at Hitler's order on November 3, 1942, and had chosen not to obey it. He had done it to save his men. He had done it because the alternative was annihilation. He had done it because he was, whatever else he was, a soldier first. And a soldier's first duty, the oldest duty, the one that predated all flags and all political orders, was to bring his men home alive. But he had also done it knowing what it would cost him. Knowing that in Hitler's Germany, disobedience was not forgiven. Knowing that the Führer, who had once showered him with praise and promotion, would see this retreat as the beginning of Rommel's fall from grace. Knowing that the man he had been, the Desert Fox, the People's Marshal, the symbol of German military excellence, was finished. He was right about that, too. The retreat from Alamein began the slow, inexorable process that ended, 14 months later, on a quiet road in Normandy, when two officers from Hitler's staff came to his door and told him he had a choice. Swallow the cyanide capsule, and his family would be spared. Refuse, and they would not. But on November 3, 1942, Rommel did not know any of that. He knew only what was in front of him, the smoke, the burning column on the coast road, the faces of his men, and the order from Berlin that he had decided, in the space of a single hour, not to obey. He picked up the telephone. He gave the order. And the army moved west. The Second Battle of El Alamein ended on November 4, 1942, with a decisive Allied victory. Montgomery's Eighth Army had inflicted the first major irreversible defeat on a German army in the war. The Axis suffered approximately 37,000 casualties, over 30% of the forces engaged. The British lost roughly 13,500 men. Rommel's retreat carried his surviving forces all the way west to El Agheila, then to Berat, then to the Mareth line inside Tunisia, a withdrawal of over 700 miles. The intelligence gathered from the battlefield, combined with the Allied landings in Morocco and Algeria 6 days later during Operation Torch, sealed the fate of the Axis in North Africa permanently. By May of 1943, the last German and Italian forces in Tunisia surrendered, and the war in Africa was over. Erwin Rommel survived the retreat from Alamein by 14 months. He fought through Tunisia, was transferred to Normandy to organize the defense of the French coast against the anticipated Allied invasion, and was wounded by a Spitfire attack on his staff car in July of 1944. He was forced to take a coma capsule on October 14, 1944, after his name surfaced in connection with the plot to assassinate Hitler on July 20. His family was spared, as promised. He received a state funeral. The hour on November 3, 1942. The hour he read Hitler's order and decided to ignore it, was not the end of Rommel's story. But it was the hour when his story changed. The hour when the man who had always moved forward found himself moving back, and discovered that sometimes the most difficult decision a commander can make is not whether to attack. It is whether to survive. The story of Erwin Rommel and the decision at El Alamein ends here. If this affected you, if you felt the weight of the moment, the impossible mathematics of lives versus orders, then you already understand why this story is important. This isn't just an incident of a general living in a desert overnight. This is about what happens when a man in uniform is given an order to kill his soldiers and has to decide within a single hour whether to obey or not. If you found value in this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like, and comment. Every week, we bring you memories from World War II that history has almost forgotten, decisions made in the dark, choices that changed everything, the people behind the headlines. These stories deserve to be told. And you are the reason they are told.